Hello, I'm Stan Grant. How wonderful it is to be back here at Brisbane Powerhouse. Thank you for that really nice welcome. This is now Australia's fastest growing city, Brisbane. It's great to have some of you from surrounding areas as well. Some have travelled from Ipswich to join us here tonight, and we're glad that you did. Joining me on the panel, Labor member for Lilley, Anika Wells, who holds one of the most marginal seats in the country. Minister for Employment and Acting Education Minister, Stuart. Director of the Griffith Asia Institute, Byrne. Former Queensland Premier and Liberal Democrats Senate candidate, Campbell Newman, and Greens Senator for Queensland, Larissa. Please welcome everyone. Great to have you all here.
I'm 20 years old. I work a minimum wage job and I study full time. I live in a constant state that I won't be able to afford fuel in my car or be able to put groceries or ever get a house. Not only this, but there's talk of war, there's talk of running out of fuel, and there's also still living through COVID. Is there any point that I keep studying, that I keep trying, that I keep wanting these aspirations, or shall I just get comfortable in bed? So Australia used to be a place that I was very happy to say I was a part of, and I saw many ambitions here. Should I just get comfortable in this paycheck to paycheck sort of lifestyle, or should I keep going? Thank you.
Keep going, Jade. Keep going. I'm sorry to hear that things look so bleak, but it is understandable, Anika. What do you offer to someone like Jade when you hear that?
It is so bloody hard to be a young person in Australia at the moment. Rent in Brisbane averages about $500 a week now. You probably know that. If you need to get to Headspace, it's 4 months wait. At Nunda, 4 out of 10 young people have never had a permanent full-time job because those jobs keep getting casualised. And I got elected in 2019. It's my first term. What staggers me is that 2019 was the first year that there were more Australians born after 1980 than before, and it was the first year that our workforce had more millennials and Zoomers in it than all of the other generations combined. But we are only 10% of the national parliament. I'm the youngest woman in the House of Reps this term, and I am 36, married, I have 3 kids and a rescue kelpie. You know, I'm at an age now where I'm starting to get really excited by orthopaedic footwear. The state of young people and their representation in our parliament is dire. So please do not get comfortable, get elected, or find one of your peers who you think would be great to represent you and your voice and your people in Parliament and get them to Canberra as soon as possible.
Yeah, Stuart, Robert, of course, what happens here now, though, is that we're hearing from Jade about just daily getting by, and we're now likely during this election campaign to see an interest rate rise, inflation going up around the world and going up here. Sadly, things are not going to get much better, are they?
Well, thanks, Jade, first of all, for your honesty. It can be difficult coming forward and saying it's hard, and it is. And every generation has its certain struggles, and we've seen coming out of COVID some of the challenges in mental health, especially as the Acting Education Minister and visiting a school this morning in Petrie, just talking to students and parents about programs they're running to help young Australians really adapt and try and overcome some of the great challenges they've had. So it's a very honest response. It's a very common response from young people in that respect as well. I've got 3 sons, and I know Anika's got a young family. I've got a 16-year-old, 14-year-old, 12-year-old who constantly tell me they're stressed as well. But at the same time, to join Anika, Australia remains a land of enormous opportunity. Yes, there are some great uncertainties, and I think they're going to continue for a long time forward, as there have been uncertainties in the past. But with that comes enormous opportunity. With unemployment at 4% and getting lower, the opportunity for a job is always there, with opportunities in terms of education, for study and for travel. In pre-pandemic, over 11 million Australians travelled. So the opportunities are there. It's just about really embracing them, studying hard, looking for them, and seeking support and help if it's needed.
I'm not going to speak for Jade, but I don't know if that's the answer you were looking for, Jade, when you said that I can't afford my rent, fuel, groceries, there's talk of war, running out of fuel, COVID, prices going up. We've asked both of you and you've told her exactly all the things that Jade knows and a pep talk about how to hang in there, but what are you actually going to do, Anika? What is the answer to what Jade is saying here? She's saying she can't afford fuel and rent and groceries. She doesn't need a pep talk.
No, and I wasn't giving you a pep talk. I was urging you to run for Parliament. I hope you do it. But I accept your point. You're talking about cost of living and a sense that people aren't looking after you, people aren't addressing these concerns that bother you day to day. And I want to say, I get it. Like, I've got 3 kids. We pay childcare fees for 3 of them. The cost of everything is going up and wages aren't. What is Labor going to do? We're going to fix wages. We have to lift wages and we have to give people good, secure jobs, because if you can take away the worry about living day to day, what your hours look like week to week, what your paycheck's going to do, and whether you're going to stay in that job beyond the contract that you might be in, then you can start to worry about getting your life together and doing things that you want to do, planning ahead.
Stuart, Robert, again, the question to you was that on your watch, your government's watch, inflation's going up, and we're on the verge of having an interest rate rise. And of course, we've heard, Jade said here, about the price of rent in Brisbane going up as well. So beyond platitudes, what are you actually going to do? What can you offer someone like that?
And I'm happy to go through what government does. I wanted to show some empathy first, because I do understand the significant challenges. It's why tax cuts are so central, to ensure that you get more money and keep more of it. It's why, in terms of coming forward to 1 July 2024, we bring forward the next round of tax cuts that knocks out an entire tax bracket. It's why the automatic stabilisers are there in terms of rent assistance for you, in terms of off-study there, as well as a range of other payments depending upon your family circumstances. I don't know if you have a partner or children. It's why the budget includes cost of living adjustment packages, especially in terms of the low income and low and middle income tax offsets. So these cost of living adjustments, these supports in terms of what's called the automatic stabilisers, either through off-study, through youth allowance, depending upon whether you're studying full-time or otherwise, the tax cut structures we're putting in place are all designed to provide as much assistance to you as possible. It's also why we're doubling down in terms of skilling. There has never been as much support going into skilling now, because we know if we can raise the skills of Australians, it leads to higher paying jobs. And I'd certainly encourage you to embrace that skilling agenda.
Larissa Waters.
Yeah, look, this is from a government that made university more expensive, when in fact it used to be free and should be free again. So thank you, Jade, for encapsulating what so many other people feel right now. It's getting really hard to get by, and you're not alone in that regard. Everything's going up except your wages. But you know what else went up? The wealth of billionaires during COVID. Mining billionaires in particular doubled their wealth. So we've actually got a growing gap between the very wealthy and ordinary people. And this government isn't doing anything to fix that. What they could and should be doing is making TAFE and uni free. They should be putting dental and mental health care into Medicare, because no one can afford to go to the dentist and no one can afford to pay for the mental health treatment that they need. And here's a suggestion. You mentioned Austudy. It's too low. And so are all of the other social support payments. They are below the poverty line, and they should be at least $88 a day. Can I just finish, stand on that point? We can have all of these things. We can have a government that works for you and not just big corporates and political donors if we make the billionaires and the big corporations pay their fair share of tax. We can raise the revenue and then fund the services that people need to address that cost of living.
All of that sounds good, Larissa Waters. It'll get applause, but debt's going up. We've had to reach into government revenue to get us through the other side of COVID. Inflation is global. Interest rates are going up around the world. What you're suggesting here is more spending, finding the money for more spending when debt is already going higher.
Well, how about we get rid of the $184 billion of stage 3 tax cuts that will go to the incredibly wealthy that do not need the help? Redeploy that money into those things that I just mentioned.
Campbell, Newman, I was struck by something that you said, and it led to your disaffection with Liberal Party, and that is that you look at Australia and you don't recognise the country anymore. What do you mean by that?
Well, I don't recognise Australia, and I guess I'm agreeing with the concerns you're expressing, because this country has lost its mojo. And I grew up as a teenager in a country that believed in national development. It was the generation of World War II who built this country, who built the highway system, alumina refineries, coal-fired power stations, dams and irrigation schemes, and there was opportunity. But I think we've forgotten where our bread's buttered, how we earn our place in the world. And I'm sorry, Senator, I don't think the prescription to deal with the issue here is more tax. I don't think it's more spending. It's actually about cutting taxes. It's about creating an environment where people can take control of their money. For example, voluntary superannuation, being able to opt out rather than letting expensive and high-priced fund managers clip the ticket on your money.
One moment, please.
And it's about creating a country and a system where individual enterprise is rewarded and people can get ahead, because that's the way we actually deal properly with the sort of problems that have been expressed. And inflation is high, Minister, not just because of international pressures, it's because of the spending that's continued post-pandemic. It's because the RBA should have moved some months ago to deal with interest rates, and sadly, and I've been through this, I'm 59 this year, and I saw what happened when the RBA didn't move many years ago, 30 years ago, didn't move quickly enough, and it made it harder and tougher for Australians eventually with the recession we'd had to have, and I don't want that for a minute. What I want for you to have Australia out there in front of you as a land of opportunity where you can get the rewards for your labour, and that's what the Liberal Democrats are all about.
Can I jump in?
Please.
And I think it's just fantastic, Jade, that you've really kicked tonight's discussion off, and fabulous to be here at this iconic cultural institution, the Powerhouse of Brisbane, one of many, can I say. But young people are going to be the future, taking us forward. And the issues you're talking about are not abstract. And I think sometimes, particularly when we're in campaign mode, and I'm the non-politician here on the panel, so it's easy for me to talk a little bit about this, but the issues you're talking about are the issues people are talking about around the dinner table.
Too right.
And they are hard. And not only is it hard to navigate the rental assistance landscape, it's hard to just find the form you have to fill out. It's hard to talk to a person to actually understand how that fits with other social welfare provisions, with your education. And you don't actually have all that many hours in the day when you're also working and you're studying. And I think we need greater recognition, particularly in this campaign. There are a few weeks left to have more young people talking about the real issues they are facing, because you are the ones who are going to be taking forward the challenges, addressing the challenges that we'll be here talking about tonight. But we're going to be looking to you. We need to invest in you. So I would just say there's an opportunity for all the politicians here to really take the concerns you've put on the table very seriously over the next couple of weeks and give you some solutions.
Jade, thank you so much. A fantastic question. Thank you so much.
It is concerning for me to see an important and potentially volatile relationship with China being hauled around for election time chess beating. If we were to experience conflict with China, we would surely need the support of our allies, namely America. However, last year, we saw Joe Biden extraordinarily forget the name of our own leader during a defence announcement. Does Australia need a reality check when it comes to our own sense of importance on the world stage? And are we drawing a target on our backs with the expectations of assistance from an ally who will not remember our names in the morning?
Caitlin.
Thank you. It's a really good question, Georgia. And one of the things I would say about this particular election campaign as well is that I've been really pleased to see foreign policy get more of a run, actually generate more of a debate. But
are you pleased with the debate?
But exactly. And we do risk the issue of politicising some issues that are going to be incredibly important for us over the next decade. And, we are seeing an incredible shift in our strategic environment. That is not at question. China's rise, but the rise of others, is really changing the landscape. I think Australians do need to have more of a conversation about the relationship we have with the United States. It is a long-standing relationship. It has been a pillar of our foreign policy, but obviously the years under Trump, really shook some of the foundations of that. We may have to step up a little bit more in our own environment and not rely as much on the United States, depending on how their political environment goes forward. I mean, I think we actually do have to think much more carefully about our relationship with China, with the rest of Asia, with the Pacific, and we've got to think about multiple issues at the same time. And this is where I think our diplomatic capability needs a huge boost. It has been underfunded and under-resourced, it's hollowed out, it's stretched thin. We don't have the capability, I would suggest, to take a robust foreign policy forward and implement that in our region.
Caitlin, is it a time for diplomacy, or is it in fact a time to, as we heard from Peter Dutton, prepare for war? Diplomacy is one thing, but is Xi Jinping in a diplomatic mind? Is Vladimir Putin in a diplomatic mind?
I mean, it's a really challenging environment we're in, there's no question, and we do have to use all the levers of statecraft that we have at our disposal. Defence is a really important part of that. I would question why we're talking about war in a national campaign. I think the rhetoric is very much shaped...
Xi Jinping is talking about war, isn't he? Directly, when he threatens to take back Taiwan by force.
He's certainly using much more aggressive language than we've seen in the past. That's absolutely right. And we have to be very prepared for a changing environment in which China is exerting more influence, more aggressively. But I would suggest that the language we've heard recently about preparing for war hasn't necessarily been helpful for Australia's reputation. It has had more of a domestic tinge. It's very much about demonstrating strength and a track record on defence. Don't get me wrong, though. I do think we need to invest in our defence capability more than we ever have before. We've got to shift our capability as well. We've got to do that while we also think about our diplomacy and our development assistance.
Campbell Newman, you served in the military. How do you see this moment right now where we've had a war in Ukraine, increasing talk of conflict out of China, a deep freeze in relations between China and the United States, talk of a new Cold... China and Australia as well, and talk of a new Cold War. How do you see this moment playing out?
Look, I've been disturbed about the language from Minister Dutton in the last few days, I've got to say. Having said that, it's probably just my feeling he's gone a bit too far. He's right to actually point out that this is a very worrying time, and the most worrying time since the 1930s. But it's not all bad. I think what's happened in the Ukraine has been a very sobering lesson already to China in terms of the way the West has reacted. If you go back to the 1930s, certain dictators at the time misjudged the democracies. They felt the democracies were weak and divided and wouldn't stand up and wouldn't fight. But ultimately, that was proved wrong. And I think perhaps Mr Putin is seeing the same thing, that it's taken a while and the people of the Ukraine have suffered terribly, but that coalition of support against the Russians has built, it has grown, and there's a determination now that perhaps I would have been surprised only a few months ago. And I think if we now turn to China, they're far more exposed. Putin holds some amazing levers in terms of the energy resources that he can withhold from Western Europe, whereas China needs to sell us products.
We need to sell the West products. It needs to buy
we
need China, don't we? It's the biggest engine of economic growth.
It's a symbiotic relationship. So I guess where I land this is that there are some bright spots like that. I think it's going to make the Chinese Communist Party sit up and take notice. But I think what we need to do now, going back to what Caitlin was saying, is we need to get a defence force set up and operating in a way that's far more about self-reliance. Now, Peter Dutton's made some great announcements, but my final point is, and this is one of the things that disappoints me, 9 years of coalition government, no subs, no missiles, no frigates that have got the right capability, patrol boats that don't work properly as well. You could go on and on and on. Well, time's up.
I want to get a response from Stuart Robb in a minute, but Larissa Waters, I'll go to you. At a time when we've heard that we need to increase our military spending, the Greens want to reduce military spending to 1.5% of GDP and renegotiate the alliance with the United States. Why would you be renegotiating the alliance with the United States at a time when China is threatening war with Taiwan, signing security pacts with the Solomon Islands, and how is that a time to reduce military spending?
Well, I think Georgia phrased it beautifully when she pointed out that the President couldn't even remember our Prime Minister's name. It is long past time that Australia had an independent.
I think he knew. I think he may have known his name. But the question is, how do we renegotiate that at a time when increasing tensions, when we should be looking to the United States, shouldn't we, as a bedrock of security in the region?
We need an independent foreign policy that puts Australia's best interests. And we are an important player in our region, and I think we have ignored our regional responsibilities for far too long. It's probably why we've seen the Solomons enter into a pact with China, because we've cut foreign aid, we've done nothing about the climate crisis that Pacific leaders have been begging us to lead on and do better on. And we also cut the Australian network, that soft diplomacy of broadcasting and reciprocal. So it's kind of no surprise that we're now in the situation that we're in. And in some ways, I agree with Campbell. It's ironic that they've spent all this money and we still don't have anything to show.
Let's go to Stuart. Robert.
You don't solve war by having more guns. The only people that benefit from war are the arms manufacturers.
Stuart Roberts,
Clearly,
for 40 years until we get the nuclear-powered submarines, according to the AUKUS deal, have we been too slow in preparing for the war that Peter Dutton's promising?
If our response on climate change is why the Solomons have gone to China, the biggest emitter in the world, I mean, it's complete nonsense. The US relationship will remain a bedrock relationship. It's widened in terms of AUKUS, in terms of Australia, UK and the United States in America. We inherited 8 years ago defence spending at 1.56% of GDP from the Labor Party. It's a statement of fact. It's now up to 2.1%. Investments are strong. Not a single military vessel boat started under Labor. Continuous shipbuilding program now, continuous. That will go forever. Across almost 52 surface and subsurface vessels. A weapons and missile program, of course, commitments now to move into a nuclear-powered boat because of the small modular reactors allowed to do it. So substantial investments. And we're right to call out the arc of influence, that unholy arc to our north. We're right to call out China's influence and what they're seeking to do. We're right to call out their economic coercion, as they're doing in terms of our trade, not just across coal exports, but across barley, across other areas, including wine. We're right to do that. We're right to call out what's happening in the Pacific Ocean. And notwithstanding your comments, which I disagree with, ma'am, we've opened 6 new embassies in the South Pacific.
There's been a bit, but we're still at the lowest of the OECD countries.
We are 50% of all development assistance in the South Pacific. We are 2/3 of all development assistance in the Solomon Islands comes from Australia. This is not an issue of neglect. This is an issue of China playing by different rules that have zero transparency in the Pacific. That's what we're facing, and it is concerning. And we should all be concerned by this, because it is going to be a challenging future in our region.
Anika, aren't there questions to be asked about Labor's consistency? When Labor was last in power, it flip-flopped on the idea of the threat from China and defence spending, going up under Kevin Rudd, coming down under Julia Gillard. We had a different approach depending on which Labor government there was. At a time when you're facing the type of challenges the world is right now, how much can Labor be relied upon?
No, I brought the receipts on this one. The government claims to have 2 great strengths, economic management and national security, and this week they've stuffed up both. To your question, Stan, what the government did, what Rudd-Gillard government did in
But it wasn't the Rudd-Gillard governments. It was Kevin Rudd who had one view and Julia Gillard who had another when it came to defence spending. And that's the question about inconsistency, isn't it?
Well, my understanding is that defence spending rose every year bar one across the 6 years. Foreign aid, which is a key element of our relationship with the Pacific, was cut by $250 million when the coalition came to power. Like Larissa was saying, soft power under Radio Australia was gutted under this government. For some remote islands in the Solomons, that is their major source of news, and it was cut by this coalition government. Climate change, I mean, these Pacific countries, 13 microstates, they talk about 3 great powers in the region. They talk about the US, they talk about China, and they talk about climate change. And this Minister of Defence was caught laughing about water lapping at their door. This government did not take their key, most existential threat seriously, and now we are suffering the consequences of it.
Stuart Roberts.
Let's look at the facts. The idea that we are suffering the consequences in the Solomon Islands because of climate change, that somehow, even though we provide 2/3 of all development assistance into the Solomon Islands, 2/3, $2.8 billion right across the board in the Pacific, $160 million per annum. In fact, the Prime Minister's first visit after the last election was to the Solomons, but apparently the Solomon Islands have chosen China because of climate change. Is just a complete and utter nonsense. We're just dealing with a different approach that China has, a lack of transparency and a different focus they've got in the South Pacific. It is of great concern. It is going to be a great challenge, and we're going to have to face up to it.
Polls have consistently shown that climate change and the environment is the biggest issue facing voters here in the Brisbane electorate. A few days ago, the coalition candidate for Flynn called the commitment to net zero by 2050 a flexible plan. While Matt Canavan said it is all over bar the shouting. Meanwhile, the party's inner city candidates continue to spruik their climate credentials. With their internal climate wars not over, how can we trust the coalition to ever take the climate change seriously?
Stuart Robert.
You can't. You can't.
Look, thanks for your question. The government's position on net zero by 2050 is absolutely clear.
That's not what Matt Canavan thought.
Well, it is. Just because 1 out of 100 in a party room has a view,
I think it's more
when
than
the
one.
Liberal government, Liberal National Government, the Liberal parties come to that agreement, the National Party has come to that agreement, the leadership and the government has come to this position, and the government has come forward to the Australian people to say, this is our position. It's quite clear, and if one person has another view, well, that's fine, but the government's position is rock solid and crystal clear. And the Prime Minister's made this clear. Indeed, the candidate for Flynn has also made the point he was talking about lead up to and not making a comment upon the actual net zero by 2050. But we cannot be clearer than this. The government is absolutely committed. We're one of few countries on earth that have brought forward a sensible plan driven by technology, not taxes, to actually get there. And of course, we've updated our projections on emissions reduction to 30 to 35% by 2030. And we're one of only a few countries on earth to actually have achieved our Kyoto 1 targets of 439 million tonnes over our Kyoto targets. Now, they are statements of fact, not in contention.
But when Matt Canavan says that, isn't there a case here that you're saying one thing to one constituency and another to another,
Like the
and
Labor
it
Party.
goes to the credibility issues, doesn't
Like
it?
the Labor Party with the coal miners.
Matt Canavan doesn't speak for the government. The Prime Minister does.
Stan, the Labor Party have tied themselves in knots about how they address this with coal miners, people in the Hunter and in central Queensland. By the way, I'm 100% with Canavan, and I also agree with Colin Boyce. And net zero, after what's happened in the Ukraine, in terms of Western Europe, is now dead.
Can I go
the grown-ups in Western Europe know that it's energy security. That's the
Campbell,
issue
you and
now.
I are at odds because the government, the Morrison government, cannot be clearer on our commitment to net zero by 2050.
Well, Barnaby Joyce
cannot
tells
be
people
clearer
different things
on our
behind closed
technology
doors.
plan. And Barnaby Joyce, as the Deputy Prime Minister, has also been clear and unanimous on his support with the government as a core member of the government that net zero by 2050.
That's not what a gentleman told me he said in Emerald recently at dinner.
The direction we're going.
Let me bring Anika in on this. Is there not a case though when you look to what's happening in Europe, you look at Boris Johnson putting their targets on hold, you look at the energy crisis facing potentially in Europe because of Russia turning off the pipes. Does this also not lead to countries like China or India who have already pushed their target dates down the line, perhaps even revising those again? Is the world not changing right now because of what we're seeing geopolitically that may affect targets like 2050?
No. And the job of good leaders is to write the story of the future that includes everybody. People like Daniel, who's a flood victim, resources workers, like who Colin's trying to represent up in Flynn. And the reason that this is a tricky issue, but it shouldn't be, is that we just have to get to our decarbonised future as quickly as possible. And there's no pathway to net zero or a decarbonised future, whatever the targets are, whatever the time, without doing more mining, which requires strong mining companies. But we have to mine different different things. We have to mine copper and lithium to get our electric vehicles, millions of them that we're going to need. We're going to need to mine other things to get our solar, our met coal probably, to get solar and wind up and running. And we need to do that because it looks after resources workers and it helps our flood victims, because it comes down to decent, hardworking manufacturing workers in electorate like mine who then build this technology that allows us to have our renewable future and allows us to sell and build wealth for our country overseas. That is the job of good leaders, to write a story that includes everybody, and that is why you have to vote for a party of government.
Thanks again to our panel, Anika Wells, Stuart Robert, Caitlin Byrne, Campbell Newman and Larissa Waters. Please thank them.
Well done. We made it. Thank you.
I want to thank everyone for sharing their questions tonight as well. It was fantastic to have your input, and please join us again next Thursday. What will the election campaign throw up? Both leaders now are back on the road next week. You'll have to wait and see. You can also join me on China Tonight on Monday night. Until then, thanks again for coming. Until then.